Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome back to the show Burt Kearns, who is a show business and pulp culture savant, according to Vanity Fair, and the author of Lawrence Tierney, Hollywood's Real Life Tough Guy, The Show Won't Go On, and Tabloid Baby. A veteran print and broadcast journalist, he is perhaps best known as an Emmy winning writer, producer, and director of nonfiction television and documentary films. His work includes the series Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura and Adults Only, The Secret History of the Other Hollywood, the documentaries Kardashian, The Man Who Saved O.J. Simpson, The Seventh Python, and Death of a Beetle, and the motion picture comedy Cloud Nine, starring Burt Reynolds. And today we're discussing his brand new book, which is wonderful, Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel. Burt, welcome back. Thanks again for coming on.
Great to be back. Thanks, Robert.
Such a wonderful book, as I mentioned, and when with so much being written about Brando, there's so many books. He's got a memoir. I really felt you knocked it out of the park with another way to look at it, which is his influence over the years. So there's so much I want to ask you. But the first thing before we get into the book was, do you remember the first movie with Brando you saw?
Well, I grew up in the 1960s. So Brando was out there. Brando was a pop culture figure. He was part of the zeitgeist. I had the poster on my wall of Peter Fonda from Easy Rider with the red, white, and blue gas tank, a black and white poster that I colored it in red, white, and blue, and the poster of Marlon Brando from The Wild One. But I was a kid then. The Godfather came out in 1972. So
Yeah.
I would have been about 16 years old. Saw The Godfather when I was 16. And to me, that was Marlon Brando. Of course, when I was about 17, Last Tango in Paris came out. And I was like, oh, we got to get in to see that. There's sex and nudity and butter and everything else. And I remember seeing that film and not watching it again for 50 years.
Oh, wow.
And then watching it 50 years later and being devastated and saying, how could I have even come close to understanding what this film was about? It wasn't about sex. It was about grief, and it was about self-flagellation and self-hatred and a life that was, wasted. And so there was a lot to learn for me when it came to Marlon Brando, because again, in researching this book, there was a lot of discovery on my part,
Mm.
because there were a lot of Marlon Brando films I hadn't seen, and a lot of influences that he had that I didn't know about, and I discovered during this research journey.
So what made you want to write it? What was the inspiration behind wanting to do this book?
I've had a very bad habit over the past couple of decades in the projects that I do. I tend to do projects and books and documentaries about people that the general public has never heard of. Try to sell a book on Lawrence Tierney, believe it or not. People are like, who? Publishers, well, Lawrence Tierney, who? Um,
We know him now.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so looking for my next project, just happened to be fortuitous that the 100th anniversary of Brando's birth was coming up in a couple of years, the 20th anniversary of his death. And my agent, who's more than an agent, sort of he's a coach and a literary guide as well, Lee Sobel, said, why don't you try something about Marlon Brando? So what could I write about Marlon Brando? As you mentioned, there's been 700-page biographies. Brando had his own autobiography. There's been so many books about Brando. How do I write something different? Well, I went back to that poster on the wall of The Wild One and started going through the history of that film, going through Brando's life, and then seeing the connections and seeing the influences that this movie wasn't his best film. It was his fifth picture. It was a biker flick before there ever was anything known as a biker flick. It was a movie that turned out, I found, to be the most influential of all his work, an influence that carries on today to you wearing a black leather jacket and a t-shirt.
Yes. Yeah, he certainly it was interesting reading the book because he had always influenced me because I'm an actor as well, and he was an influence on me. But then I started to think, wait a minute, because I, even though I'm wearing this today because you're on and we're talking about Brando, I'm like, wait a minute, all I wear is white t-shirts, jeans, and
Yeah.
I forgot how much it's actually influenced my fashion. And as you said, fashion, art, the political activism, even comic book films, actors doing comic book films becoming more acceptable for prestigious actors to do that sort of thing. And so much of it hadn't really dawned on me how much his influence had spread, and a lot of it, probably all of it, positive as well. So
There wouldn't be a Leatherman in the Village People if not for the Wild
right,
One. I think it all comes down to that.
yes,
But of course, for the first step is acting. I mean, Brando revolutionized acting on stage, and then he went and revolutionized acting on film. People that I spoke to, real cinema experts, compare Brando to Bob Dylan. How when Bob Dylan came on the scene, pop music changed forever. Before that, you could be Rosemary Clooney, you could be Frank Sinatra singing other people's songs. When Bob Dylan came along, suddenly you had to sing your own song, sing your own truth. And that's what Brando brought to acting. I mean, on stage, he was a sexual animal presence unlike anyone had seen on Broadway before. It was a whole different kind of acting. His character, Stanley Kowalski in A Streetcar Named Desire, was the villain in the piece. He was a rapist. He was a brute who brutalizes the poor um, the poor Blanche Dubois, but he was so good in the role that the audience sided with him. I mean, if when Brando's on stage, if he had a cold, that day his character have a cold. If he had an itch, he'd scratch it. He would play to the audience. And the director, Elia Kazan, said, "I'm not sure what to do. I can't tell him to act worse." Well, he changed the role there. And then when he came to Hollywood, he did the same thing. We're still just like they still talk about looking for the new Bob Dylan. People still want to be the new Marlon Brando.
what would you say? Because you talk about in the book, and many people have said he revolutionized acting. What would you say would be the difference between other actors who came from similar training, like who were famous even before him, Montgomery Clift, actors like that? What would be the difference there? Would you say, would you say there's something about what he brought to just those kind of roles, the vulnerability, even though they were really rough men like Stanley Kowalski? I mean, is there a difference?
Well, yeah, when Brando played a character like a Kowalski, or he played an army officer in Sayonara, or an army officer in Reflections in a Golden Eye, if he played a spy in Morituri, he wasn't playing it the way you would expect that character to be played. He wasn't a Steve McQueen or a
Right.
Clint Eastwood. He definitely wasn't a Gary Cooper or a Clark Gable. He played every role with a vulnerability and a questioning of his own masculinity. I think that was part of it.
Right.
People referred to the bisexual charisma that he had. He had that, and it was undeniable, and he brought that to his roles. He ushered in a new leading man in Hollywood. Before him, you had a Clark Gable, you had a Gary Cooper, who read their lines and they read them very well, and the next person would read his lines. Brando wouldn't. He'd be criticized because he used cue cards. Later, he used earpieces, and they said he was lazy. Well, Brando was lazy in his life in many ways, but he wasn't lazy in acting. And this whole thing of using cue cards, hey, I could have been a contender. He's in the back of that cab and he's looking up toward the roof of the cab because he's got lines up there. He did that deliberately. It was a way to make his acting and to make it real. And
Yeah.
that's what he did. People don't talk the way they talk in that TV show, The West Wing, that rat-a-tat chatter back and forth. Somebody says something to you, you take a moment,
Right.
sinks in, then you come up with that's what I should have said moment. And Brando did that throughout his work.
Mm,
And it had a great influence on the actors that followed, as well as his contemporaries who were forced to follow in his trail.
right. I one thing that you wrote about with because you wrote extensively about the Wild One, and I actually never knew that he was disappointed with the way it turned out, because as you said, he wanted to explore the psychology behind the biker, why the bikers do what they do, and why they are rowdy and violent. I watched it again recently, and I was curious. I was looking for that, and I was curious what you thought. Do you think they got to some of the psychologies driving those men, or was maybe Brando right that was a letdown?
Well, people look at it as a biker flick, a rock and roll biker flick, the flick that ushered in rock and roll culture. They have to remember there were no biker flicks at this time. Brando had done 4 movies before this. 3 of those roles wound up getting him Academy Award nominations for Best Actor. The role he did after The Wild One on the Waterfront would win him his first Academy Award as Best Actor. This flick was produced by Stanley Kramer. Kramer had produced Brando's first film, which was called The Men, which was about the plight of paraplegic war veterans after World War II. Stanley Kramer did message movies. He did films that had sort of a liberal social bias, and they were messages. He gave messages in his films. In this film, The Wild One, Brando and Kramer wanted to address the issue of World War II veterans who came back from this war, saw terrible things that they couldn't talk about, and they couldn't fit back into the white picket fence society. So they took to the road with their friends, formed these gangs. At the same time, there was great hubbub over and concern over juvenile delinquency in the years after World War II. Kids were growing up too fast, they were forming gangs, etc. Brando wanted to get all those issues out. And he also wanted to make it clear why these people were rebelling, why these people couldn't fit into the white bread dawn of the Eisenhower era. He really wanted to show that the so-called straights were just as liable for this violence as were the bikers and the juvenile delinquents. Well, of course, they made the film, and the censors, I think it was the Breen Commission, right away started taking out the scenes that Brando thought were important. And so in the end, yes, you have a film that has a lot of violence, a lot of hijinks. You don't really get the idea that they're trying to bring across a social message, but he brought about something else. They forced Brando to read a prequel to the movie where he says, this is something that happened in a town and it could never happen anywhere else. It just happened to happen in this town. And I was saved by a girl. Well, Brando said, wait a minute. When we spoke to the bikers, they said this could happen in any town. It could happen tomorrow. I don't want to read this. So he read it in a lisping, high-pitched voice as an FU to the censors and to the producers who made him do it. Right. Well, he kept that voice throughout the film. So you had a 28-year-old man playing like a teenage juvenile delinquent, dressed very fussily in a black leather jacket and a cap and his rolled up jeans, etc., who in the film is met by a rival motorcycle gang who look much more like those guys did back in the early 50s. They're wearing army surplus clothes, rat tails, raccoon caps, etc., kilts. They look crazy and they're drunk. While Brando's group is a bit more military and, it must say, a bit more gay.
Yeah.
They did not have women with them, but Lee Marvin's gang, Lee Marvin played the rival. They had the women that followed them, etc. And so Brando played this role very much like a teenage boy who's scared of girls. And then that's where people start looking into the subtext of the film. You know, they bring in his bisexual charisma. You look at scenes, you wonder why he and Lee Marvin are rolling around together and wrestling so much. And you're wondering why the critics at the time said, you know, this movie really got a little bit dull when the girl came in. There was much more passion between Brando and Lee Marvin. Right. What he wanted to come across in this film didn't. And he walked away from it, moved on. He went on to his next role. He went on to On the Waterfront. But the film happened to be released at a time when this youth revolution was beginning. There wasn't a youth market. This film wasn't directed toward a youth market. There was no such thing. It was directed toward adults and youth. It was banned in places. Well, kids saw it and they related to this. And it wound up sparking this youth revolution this rock and roll revolution, even though there was not a lick of rock and roll in the entire film. Brando was a jazz man. It was standard jazz music in this film. There's no rock and roll in it, but the kids saw it and they related to this character. It also just happened to be released around the same time the U.S. Supreme Court came out with its Brown versus Board of Education ruling, which said that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The civil rights movement was starting to simmer at this point. Brando's group was called the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club. They were the Black Rebels coming into Wrightsville.
Right.
They spoke in this jazz lingo, this bebop, rebop lingo that Black jazz musicians and zoot suiters used in the 1940s. So Brando was really fomenting a revolution in American society, but took no responsibility. To him, it was just a role. So that was very, so those are the sort of things that I was finding while doing this research and being surprised because I didn't know this going in.
Well, the other thing I thought you did really well was that because it's not a biography, but you had things about his life in the book. How did you go about picking what to include from his upbringing, his childhood going forward? Was it to focus on more of his rebellious side, and even when he was a young man, or how did that process evolve?
Well, I figured what wound up happening was I took his life and took us through his life through the basic high points and used that as jumping off points toward what that part of his life or what that decision influenced in later years or at the same time. I found out immediately that, first of all, Brando growing up had what might be called an abusive childhood. He had a mother who was an alcoholic who he had to go pick up from bars and often from the side of the road. He had a dismissive father who was a philanderer, always on the road. The parents were breaking up and moving the family around back and forth. Brando was put into military school. And I found there that Brando, I called him a rebel in search of a cause from the very beginning. He was looking for something, he was somebody who could be a bully, could have a prankish sense of humor. But when he was in military school, he saw somebody torturing a cat. He went after that guy and said, you don't do that, to an animal. So he always had that social conscience. And it wasn't until he moved to New York when his parents said, he'd been kicked out of military school. What are we going to do with him? Well, let's send him to New York where his sister's living. And he did well in the theater club at the military school. And he was always good as an actor in summer camp. Maybe he can take some acting lessons at the new school for social research in Greenwich Village. So Brando shows up in Greenwich Village in the mid-1940s, early 1940s, and he stands out immediately. And he manages to find an acting teacher, Stella Adler, who became, his mentor, his guru, his teacher. And she introduced him to far more than acting. I mean, she was part of that original actors group in the 1930s who brought in the Stanislavski method. Yeah. She was the only one who actually went to Russia, worked with Stanislavski, and saw that his method wasn't really what they were teaching in New York. She had his own updated version that she taught her student Brando. She also happened to be part of a Jewish acting dynasty. Her father was a great actor in Yiddish theater. Her brother was an actor and director. And they were intellectual New York Jews, the first Jewish people that Brando ever met. And they turned him on to literature. And of course, they turned him on to social causes. He got to know firsthand the effects of what was going on during World War II to Jews in Europe and the Holocaust. And that made him even more want to do something that made a difference. And that's why in his career, he often put acting aside for his activism, often took roles just to pay for his activism. It did have an effect on his career. So when I looked up on IMDb, Robert De Niro, who is 80 years old now, that's the age that Brando was when he died. De Niro at last count had 135 roles. Brando, let me check.
I think it's about 50,
48. And a few of them are after he died because they count as, voiceovers in Godfather video games. So, and they were making more films in those days. he took his time, did what he wanted. It meant little to him. An actor with so much talent, so much natural talent, he just it just came so naturally to him that it mattered very little to him. The greatest actor of the 20th century would have rather been known as the greatest activist or inventor.
Well, I find that so fascinating about him, and I can't help but wonder if and we can only speculate how he may react to your book, but if he read your book and saw about all the influence he's had, do you think he'd laugh? Do you think he'd dismiss it, or what do you think his reaction might be?
I would think he would dismiss it as he did, dismiss it in his own book.
Right.
He said, yes, the Wild One did launch this revolution, et cetera. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and this would have happened anyway.
Right,
But
right.
I think quite clearly it would not have, because he continued to do this, through his life in very many surprising ways. Not only from the Wild One. I think the Wild One was the one that was most important, but you go up to Last Tango in Paris, which I think had a tremendous social impact.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's one of my favorite performances of his. And what I like that you point out some of the performances he gave in the 60s that are quite good. And it's interesting that people often look at the 60s as his like poison decade, or he did all these terrible movies. All these movies are so terrible, but then you think, One Eye Jacks, The Chase, Reflections of a Golden Eye. There are some duds, but there are some really interesting movies and performances. I mean, what do you generally think of that decade for him?
I went into it in my research saying, okay, here we go. We're going into the lost decade of Marlon Brando, as he dedicated most of his time to activism with, Native American rights, civil rights, even rights in the third world and in India. He was very concerned with the caste system in India, wanted to do something about that, and was very concerned about, developing nations being hurt by American imperialism. He did the film The Ugly American,
Mm.
based on that. And I watched these films, and I was amazed at how he never phoned it in any performance, and what he brought to these films. And some of these films, I think, are among his best work. I think that Reflections in a Golden Eye, again, a monumental picture. It was a
Oh
pot boiler. It was a southern, it was a pot boiler, and it was lurid. But here he was, a leading man, a Hollywood legend at the time, playing a repressed homosexual army major. This was a first
yeah.
as far as that went. Then, okay, I got to tell you, the one movie that really got me, Bedtime Story, okay. 1964, co-written by Paul Henning, who created Green Acres. Can't go wrong. Brando plays a con man who is a con man in the U.S. Army in Europe, and he manages to con a lot of women out of money and love, etc. He hooks up with David Niven, who's a debonair con man on the French Riviera, who manages to con jewelry and everything out of women, make a lot of money doing that. They team up, they become rivals. The thing is that in this film, Brando is playing a comic character. He's doing Jerry Lewis. He is doing wild, hysterically funny scenes. And the reviews at the time, New York Times, are saying, Marlon Brando continued to surprise us because we never knew how funny this guy was. And this really, really works.
Mm.
Fast forward a dozen years. Well, actually, no, fast forward about almost 20 years. There's a movie called Dirty Rotten Scoundrels,
Right.
based on Bedtime Story. The New York Times review says this is based on a movie that we really don't remember. Well, they forgot about that glowing review they gave. And I watched that film, and then I said, well, wait a minute. I go back and I started watching the film scene by scene, comparing the scenes. Steve Martin is imitating Brando. Even camera shots are the same throughout this film. They threw in some 80s references and some bathroom humor and let Steve Martin do some of his shtick. But in the end, it looked to me like the Brando film was more timeless. I could watch the Brando film today and not say, who's Denny Terrio? What are they doing dance fever jokes for, in a film that I'm watching 20 years later? Well, then this came too late for the book, but I want to mention this. Dirty Rotten Scoundrels was directed by Frank Oz. Frank Oz is known for the Muppets. I think he was the voice of Miss Piggy, etc. After that, he had a very good career into the 1990s doing comedy films. Until the end of the 90s, he wanted to do a thriller, a crime film. And he does a crime film called The Score. And it's about three generations of criminals. You've got Edward Norton, you've got Robert De Niro, and Marlon Brando. And Marlon Brando gave Frank Oz such a hard time during this film, to the point where Oz had to stand on the street and let Brando relay his directions to De Niro to give him to Brando.
Yeah.
And I think it's because of what Frank Oz did with Dirty Rotten
I was
Scoundrels.
gonna ask you. I wonder if that's because I always wondered why did he give Frank Oz such a hard time? I think he even called him Miss Piggy.
Called him Miss Piggy, yeah.
And I we could only speculate, but I hadn't seen Bedtime Story, and I read an interview you did recently where you gave your top 5 Brando, which outside of the Godfather, because we all put the Godfather up there. So Burn on the Waterfront, Last Tango in Paris, The Wild One, and Bedtime Story. And I thought I should watch it. And you're right. I mean, it's not. I would say it's a great movie, but he's so funny in it, and the dynamic between him and David Niven, I thought was really, really good. And that was a film that often in biographies, I'd see televised biographies, when they would get to the quote unquote lost decade, they'd cut to a shot of him with the seagull on his head
Right.
under the sand from Bedtime Story, almost to make fun of him. And it's a shame. I don't know if that has anything to do with maybe sometimes these really heavy dramatic actors, when they try comedy, people don't always take it seriously. I don't know, but and he is such a funny person. I mean, sometimes I just watch his interviews on CNN with Larry King, Dick Cavett, Connie Chung to laugh, because he is such a funny
He
person.
always was. I mean,
Yeah.
when you go back to The Godfather, I was lucky. I've done a lot of documentaries and a lot of television work. I produced and wrote one feature film. It was called Cloud Nine. It starred Burt Reynolds as this is the apology part, as the coach of an all stripper beach volleyball team. But my co-writer and co-producer, along with Brett Hudson, was Al Ruddy, Albert S. Ruddy, the producer of The Godfather, who won the Academy Award for The Godfather. The executive producer was Gray Fredrickson. Gray was the assistant producer on The Godfather, won the Academy Award for producing Godfather 2, and also produced Apocalypse Now and The Outsiders, worked with Coppola throughout his career. So I got to work with these two legends who knew Brando and worked with Brando and got to hear stories about Brando. That was sort of my one person removed from Brando. And again, they would talk about just what an unassuming character he was. He wasn't this person that was on a mountaintop as he was in real life. When they did The Godfather, he was considered box office poison. Paramount wanted anybody else, Ernest Borgnine, Frank Sinatra, Laurence Olivier. They did not want Marlon Brando. But when they did hire him, the young actors who worked with him couldn't believe they were working with Marlon Brando. He had, Jimmy Caan and John Cazale, and Duvall had worked with him in The Chase, I believe, and Al Pacino. They were working with Marlon Brando, and he put them at ease very quickly when they began having mooning contests throughout the production. And this is where they would expose their rear ends to each other from cars on the set, etc. And Brando, during that very famous opening scene of The Godfather, the big wedding scene, during a lull in the production, Brando was on the stage and mooned a crowd of 700 extras, or however many there were, and everybody said Brando is the king of the mooners. So he had a sense of humor for sure.
Oh, absolutely. I love, I'm sure you heard Robert Duvall tell the mooning story, because I think James Caan was about to meet him, and he kept saying, "You got to moon him, you got to moon him." And that's how he introduced himself to Brando. And, Brando, of course, cracked up. It's interesting that because before I read the book, I was just flipping through, looking at the pictures. And then when I looked at the picture of Johnny Depp at his trial a couple of years ago against Amber Heard, I thought, oh, I wonder what that's about. And then as when I got to that and you talked about the connection between Brando's this when his son was on trial for murder and how he finally addressed the press, even though he never talked to the press, and he did everything he could to get his son off or a lenient sentence. And now we see Depp also televising that, having that trial televised, and down to the wardrobe. He had the ponytail, and you and others that you interviewed said, oh, it's like he's doing, and they were close friends, as we know, that he was doing a Brando. But can you elaborate a little bit on what doing a Brando means in the connection between the two trials? Is it the wardrobe? Did you feel he was performing while he took the stand? I know some people accuse Brando of doing that when he took the stand that time for his son. What do you think? What is that about?
Yeah, well, Brando had to take the witness stand during the sentencing hearing for his son Christian, who had a very tragic life. Christian was brought up in child custody battles with Brando's first wife, Anna Cashby, ugly, kidnappings and everything else through his life. He had a very, very rough upbringing. He actually forced Brando into the public when he shot to death the lover of his half-sister, Cheyenne, in Marlon Brando's television room while Brando was in bed.
Right.
Brando did everything he could to save his son. He felt very guilty as a father of the mistakes that he had made. And when he testified, when he managed to wedge his huge girth into that witness box, the father of the victim said that was the best performance of Brando's life. And in a way, of course, it was. It was heartfelt. It was method, as you would say. Brando brought in his own experience and brought that to the story that he told about his own life. Johnny Depp was an acolyte of Brando's, but also a friend. He directed Brando in 2 films. He starred alongside him in Don Juan DeMarco, and they really hit it off. I think that Johnny Depp, as far as new Brandos go, was very much like Brando, is very much like Brando in the roles he plays. Brando played Christian Fletcher in Mutiny on the Bounty, not as the swashbuckling hero, but as a fop and a kind of a strange, foppish upper class guy. Very different than you would expect it to be played. Just as Captain Jack Sparrow as a kind of a foppish Keith Richards drunken bisexual type that Johnny Depp played in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Johnny Depp also would take roles like Ed Wood or Willy Wonka, things that you wouldn't expect the macho leading man to take. In court, he sort of did the same thing, spoke very quietly, haltingly, put on his best performance. And I was speaking at the time with Gray Fredrickson, who had worked with Brando, knew Brando, worked with him on Apocalypse and The Godfather. And we're on the phone at that time. He said, you watching him on television? He's doing Brando. Johnny Depp's doing Brando. And I had to agree.
It's quite something. And again, just something I never would have thought of. And that connection was really, really fascinating to me, as well as so many others. And one of them, like I touched on earlier, was the influence on the comic book films, as I mentioned, becoming more prestigious. And before Superman, they were mostly tongue-in-cheek kind of films that people really didn't take too seriously. And now here Brando comes, he does Superman. Of course, I'm sure the $13 million it wasn't to change superhero movies. 13 million,
No.
not too many days of work. He does this film, and then of course, 12 years later, or 11 years later, you had Nicholson playing Joker and Batman, and now no one criticizes Samuel L. Jackson, Robert Downey Jr., Scarlett Johansson, well-known serious actors doing these parts. And again, it was a connection I never thought of. I mean, for me, I do like some of those films. I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy about them. So it's a bit of a disappointment, but that was the influence. But I was curious how that sort of, that connection came to be about for you.
Well, the producers knew it. The Salkins were putting a lot of money into Superman 1, and they were filming part of Superman 2 at the same time. And how are they going to going to get some respect for this film they're doing, which was a comic book film. They hired Gene Hackman. They hired Ned Beatty, who both played it like comic book characters.
Right.
They hired Marlon Brando. He could always use the money. He needed the money. And again, he was the highest paid actor in Hollywood when he did Mutiny on the Bounty. He became the highest paid actor in Hollywood when he did Superman. How could he turn it down?
Right.
He shot for a couple of days. I think he was in the first film for about 7 minutes, and they use him again in the second film. But he did something different. He played it straight. He brought the emotion to the character of this, person on the planet Krypton who's sending his son off and never going to see his son again. He didn't play it like a comic book character. He played it like he was doing Streetcar,
Yeah.
like he was
Yeah.
doing Last Tango. It's interesting, when he did Last Tango in Paris, he had a director, Bertolucci, who didn't speak English and encouraged Brando to ad lib a lot of the film. And so, the scene everybody talks about in Last Tango is the scene with the butter, whatever, the rape scene. The real devastating scene is the scene where he's in a hotel with the corpse of his wife.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And he is speaking to her. And that was totally ad-libbed. He brought in stuff from his own life and it was too much for him. And he said, I'm never, ever going to put that much of myself into a role ever again.
Right.
And he didn't. And he made this superhero movie, and he brought a lot of class and status to Superman. I mean, it was a winky movie. I mean, Christopher Reeve, I think he was a classically trained actor, and he was very aware of the fact that this was going to be a big film and was going to play it seriously. Didn't like the fact that when he worked with Brando let him know this is a joke. He didn't take it as seriously as Reeve wanted, and Reeve went public with that. But Brando, when the cameras were on, played his part very seriously and added a lot of gravitas to the film. So much that I believe they brought him back in around 2007 in one of the remakes of Superman, or one of
the Superman Returns, the one Kevin Spacey and I actually haven't seen it, but I know they used
Brandon Routh, I think was the
singer,
Bryan Singer's film. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, the Bryan Singer one. I remember Christopher Reeve telling, that you touched on, Brando was not taking it seriously. And I'm sure this Christopher Reeve, apparently, I think he confronted him like, you got to, hey, this is like a big deal to me. So it's like, and I think he sent him, Brando sent him flowers or I guess that was an apology or a peacekeep making,
Yeah.
I like that story. But you're right. The sense that after Last Tango, we didn't see another performance from him. Here he was back on top with Godfather, Last Tango, Academy Award nominations, 1 win, which of course, as we know, he didn't accept. And then he doesn't work again for another 4 years. And yeah, you're right. He never did another performance like that vulnerable or that raw ever again. And I know he felt that Bertolucci was manipulative and got certain things out of him. And I should be careful saying that because I love Bertolucci, but I've had so many arguments over Bertolucci with some of his directorial methods with people. So I don't want Bertolucci canceled for anyone already steaming up watching this. But we can only speculate. But I wonder if that had anything. Maybe he just thought, he felt manipulated and he didn't want to maybe have a director do that again. I wonder if did you have any thoughts about?
Yes, I think he most definitely did. I mean, now we see this came up shortly before her death. Maria Schneider, I think she or her sister had written a book where she had complained about the rape scene. I look at it now online. People think that Marlon Brando actually raped this woman on set, that it was a simulation, when they had clothes on, et cetera. And Brando felt manipulated, and he felt that he gave too much in that. His later roles after that instead became roles in which he would add strange affectations to his characters. This is something that Johnny Depp picked up as well. He did the Missouri Breaks, where he plays this regulator, and he shows up in a scene in drag. I mean, first of all, he's using the Irish accent that he used in the film The Nightcomers, and he shows up in drag and does like this comedic performance, which critics at the time said, ruined the film. It took the seriousness out of this film. And you look at it now, these years later, and you say, that's pretty great. You look at what
Yeah.
he did in more of a little known film called The Formula, where he
Oh
was
yes.
Gene Hackman, I believe. And Brando
George
showed
C.
up on
Scott.
set.
You mean with George C. Scott, right? The
George
formula.
C. Scott, I'm sorry, George C.
Yeah.
Scott. He shows up on set with, plugs in his nose. He shaved his head. He made himself fat, and he had an earpiece to pretend that he was deaf, but actually they were feeding the lines into his ear. And he did this throughout. I guess the culmination would have been the island of Dr. Moreau, which is just Looney Tunes, which is just crazy. But he took these roles. He took smaller roles to pay for whatever activities he needed to pay for, whether it was his environmental work in Tahiti or paying for his family or paying for any projects that he had. And although they were small roles, they would stand out, and it would be enough to promote the movie or sell the movie because he was in these pictures.
Right. Right. One thing that I had read about this, and you wrote about it in the book, were these acting classes he did towards the end of his life, which were filmed. Do you know why the executor of his estate won't release it?
Well, imagine this: Marlon Brando, again, the greatest actor of the 20th century, in my opinion and many people's opinions. This legend needed the money. And he says, I'm going to do what they do on QVC and those home shopping networks. Somebody said, if you record a couple of acting classes, you can put them on tape and sell them on television to make money that way. And so he said, great idea. So we rented out a studio in Hollywood and put on these acting classes. They invited people from various acting schools. There was a guy named Tony Kaye, who's sort of a provocative director. Tony Kaye did American History X with Edward Norton about the American Nazi.
Yeah.
And he got in a fight with the studio, and the producers wanted his name taken off the film, wanted to be credited as Humpty Dumpty, etc. He hired Tony Kaye to film everything. Had a camera crew in there, had a bunch of celebrities in there, and Brando comes out onto this makeshift stage dressed as a woman, as this 400-pound woman, and did the entire lecture in drag, and then mooned the audience when he was done doing his little speech. This happened shortly after 9/11.
Right.
Tony Kaye, wanting to upstage Brando a bit, showed up dressed as Bin Laden the next day, and they caused a huge uproar, and they wound up getting rid of Tony Kaye and bringing other people. And it was a course called Lying for a Living. And people like Michael Jackson showed up. Robin Williams was there, Whoopi Goldberg, Sean Penn. People would come in and see this over these couple of weeks that they shot this. And then it was up to Brando to edit it. And he tried to edit it, and he just couldn't get it together. And then he died.
Yeah.
And so the executor of his estate has these tapes of these films. And I guess he sees that, it might be embarrassing to see Brando. First of all, Brando was very old at the time. He wasn't in good health. There happened to be a producer, Phil Lander, who I worked with, who got in touch with me and said, I was there. I was I was part of the Sanford Meisner School, and they brought us in there, and I got to see this stuff. And so I talked to Phil about it. Phil's in the book, talking about this thing, and he said, Brando was very old, and he was very large, and everything he said went against what I had been learning and being taught over the previous years. He was saying it's just all BS. It's nothing. Just it's just lying. Just go out there and lie. Acting is easy. Everybody lies. Everybody acts. Just be yourself. Don't worry about all these things they're teaching you. And he said he was telling the truth in his course on lying.
I hope one day they release. I would love to see that. Someone has to arm wrestle that guy at a
that and The Day the Clown Cried. Let's see.
Oh yes,
feature.
Yes, one day we'll get that. But again, the book is called Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel. And if you're a Brando fan or even a movie fan in general, fan of acting, you got to get this book. Where's the best place for people to go get it? Is it available pretty much anywhere online, Amazon, places like that?
It's available anywhere online. We on marlonbrandobook.com is the website. And there's a link to the world famous Larry Edmonds bookshop on Hollywood Boulevard where you can get a signed copy and you can get it personalized if you want. I don't mean to do an advertisement like that, but
Oh, no.
otherwise it should be available everywhere, I hope.
Great, fantastic. And I know I already thanked you for thanking me in the book, but I just want to do it on the show. But I'm so I can die happy now saying I'm thanked in a Brando book.
Well, thanks for the inspiration. I mean, there you go.
My pleasure. And if people want to follow you on social media, Burt, where's the best place for them to go?
Wow, sort of everywhere. MarlonBrandoBook.com. There's a BurtKearns.com. I'm Burt Kearns on Instagram and Tabloid Baby on X, I think it's called X on Twitter.
Yeah.
Google Burt Kearns, Marlon Brando. I'll pop up somewhere.
There's also, I noticed you created a group, a Facebook group for it on Facebook for the new book.
Oh, yes, there's a Facebook group as well for Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel.
Right.
Please join.
And I'll leave the links in the description box below for where you can follow Burt and join that group. And I'll just also plug your last fantastic book, which the Lawrence Tierney, Hollywood's Real Life Tough Guy, which Burt talked to me about on this show about a year and a half ago. And I'll leave the link in the description box below if you want to check out that interview. But that's also a fantastic book. And you have another book coming out, I heard, sometime in the...
I do. I have a book coming out on October 1st. What actor can follow Marlon Brando? Who has the talent, the bisexual charisma, and just the power of Marlon Brando, but Shemp Howard of the Three Stooges? It's a biography of Shemp.
Oh,
when
wow.
we started this book, we had found that there had been biographies and autobiographies of all the members of the Three Stooges, all 6 there were eventually, but none of Shemp. And so I got to work on a book about Shemp, and it should be received controversially, I should say.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to that. And so, Burt, thank you again. So
thank you. What are you going to wear for the Shemp? The Shemp
I don't know. I need a mop top
yeah.
or something.
Exactly. Oh, cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is exclusive content that I create month in and month out. And as a subscriber, you are able to vote on polls and contribute to what I do on Patreon month in and month out. So head over to the link for full details. You can also leave a donation directly to my YouTube channel by pressing the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on the thanks link and you can leave a donation there if you choose to. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner. To your top left in just a second, just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes. Also click the like button and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of this episode. Also, you can also share the episode. All of these things are what produce traction to my YouTube channel. So I appreciate you watching and thank you again. And I will see you in the next episode.